Hello and welcome to Algorithm Integrity Matters. Insights for financial services leaders who want to enhance fairness and accuracy in their use of data, algorithms, and AI. I'm your host, Yusuf Mullah. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Shea Brown, the founder and CEO of BABL AI. BABL AI is a specialized firm that audits and certifies AI systems, consults on responsible AI best practices, and offers online education on related topics. BABL's mission is to ensure that all algorithms are developed, deployed, and governed in ways that prioritize human flourishing. Shea is a founding member of the IAAA, the International Association of Algorithmic Auditors, and he also serves on the board of directors of For Humanity, amongst various other initiatives. Shea, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you tell us a bit about how BABL came about?
Yeah, so I was a professor of astrophysics at the University of Iowa for, 11 years, which is a kind of weird place to start for AI auditing. But in my research, I studied methods for detecting objects in the sky autonomously. So naturally it led, because there's so much data, that if we had every human on Earth looking at this data from the sky their entire lives, we still would not get through it. So we had to come up with automated methods. So that led naturally to machine learning and AI. And so it became a pretty integral part of my research. And around 2018, I had decided I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted to sort of start a company around AI. And my original intention was to have it as like a, building space AI for NASA or something that was adjacent to my astrophysics research. But around that time was also when a lot of the harms that AI could cause were being exposed. So bias in algorithms, the ProPublica article came out, Cambridge Analytica scandal around sort of social media and the algorithmic driving of behavior on social media. And so I ended up sort of focusing more on the ethics and the governance of these systems, and auditing felt like a good fit for my kind of scientific brain. How do we interrogate these systems to identify how they could go wrong and mitigate that? And so that was the beginning, and we've kind of stuck to our roots, luckily, since 2018.
And what are the key types of work that you now do as BABL?
Yeah, so we focus, our core is our sort of compliance audits for AI systems. And compliance or regulatory risk is, of course, just one of the many risks that we worry about. But in terms of what companies will pay for at the moment, it's for compliance. And so we do a lot of work around hiring systems, HR systems that would like screen resumes and things. There are laws in the United States and elsewhere, anti-discrimination laws that require that those systems sort of are not discriminatory. And in particular, New York City has a really strict law that requires third-party auditing. And so a lot of our clients come from there. We also do more sort of technical testing of these systems. So in addition to sort of auditing other people's testing of the system, which is sort of where those compliance audits come from, we also get hired to do direct testing of AI systems for various properties like robustness or accuracy or bias. We also have done a lot of kind of foundational work on risk and impact assessments. So a lot of our early work and a lot of people in our company came from sort of law, philosophy, risk background. And so we published some work on how to assess these systems for risk, so the risk and impact assessments. And so sometimes we get hired to really focus on what are the risks associated with the system, both for external stakeholders and also internal kind of compliance or operational risk. And finally, we have sort of by accident started an educational arm of our business. And it really came from wanting to make sure that our own auditors had some uniform training and just to demonstrate to regulators or external stakeholders that we had some standard for our own auditors. But we've opened it up to other people. And so we now have an AI and algorithmic auditing certification program, which started out as just training and now has become much more formal certification process.
And you've been embarking on some AI literacy courses as well for the broader base of employees beyond those that are focusing on auditing. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's also was a little bit by accident. I mean, our position as auditors, we just get exposed to the common risks of these systems. And so we just have a really intimate knowledge, I guess, of where these systems could go wrong. And it just translates so well to like, what do you as an HR professional or you as a person who's, doing marketing or managing customer service or something that uses AI, like what would you need to think about in terms of mitigating risk, both compliance and reputational risk? And so people asked us, do you have training in these areas? We see your more advanced training. Do you have something that's a little more sort of boiled down for the general workforce? And so we've just put it together, and the AI literacy requirement in the EU Article 4 of the EU AI Act comes into force very soon in a couple of weeks. And I think there's just a lot of pressure on organizations to have something on paper to demonstrate that they've trained their workforce. And so, again, a little bit by accident, but we're happy we did it.
I want to switch into some of the work you've been doing with organizations. I mean, we met through the IAAA, and I know you're involved in For Humanity. So one of the founding members of the IAAA, so that's the Algorithmic Auditors Association, and then For Humanity, the not-for-profit. Can you tell us about those organizations that you're involved in and what that looks like for you? And I guess what got you involved in those in the first place?
Yeah, so I think as an organization, BABL has always been, grounded in research. A lot of us were academics or are academics still. And so, we approach problems from a very like first principles point of view. And so we're always trying to research, but we recognize that we can't come up with these things on our own. And, just because we say that this is the way things should be, that's not the way consensus works. And so early on, I think even in 2018, I was looking for areas that BABL could get involved in to try to build some consensus around this. And For Humanity, Ryan Carrier, the executive director, I met Ryan in an IEEE working group on bias. And he told me about For Humanity, and the goal of which was to build audit criteria for doing these sort of AI audits or algorithmic audits. And so that was super compelling. And so I became one of the first sort of members and fellows trying to grow that organization so that we can build consensus around this. And so I've been involved, and I'm now a board member, and that they've been doing some amazing work. And I know you've been involved and working with them, and it is a very collaborative environment. And there's a lot of, it's really like democracy at its best. It feels like with a lot of people building sort of crowdsourced guidelines. But as it evolved and regulations started coming online where people had to do audits now, I felt like there was a need for some sort of professionalization of the field, because a lot of people in For Humanity are not necessarily auditors. They're just either concerned citizens or they're professionals from other areas that have expertise that they can weigh in on. And so some of the companies that sort of were doing early work, Etiquus is another one, which is a Spanish company. They're now in the US, and BABL and other academics that were writing about AI auditing, we sort of got together, had a conference in Barcelona, and we went to talk to regulators in Brussels. This was a couple of years ago. And that initial group sort of got together afterwards and realized we needed a professional organization. And so that was where the IAAA started. And luckily it's been growing, and we work together there as well. And I think that serves a complementary role to For Humanity, where For Humanity, does do work and training around of auditors, but it's much more about their particular certification scheme. It's not about broadly auditors as a profession and making sure that there's a group that's advocating for them. And that's where the IAAA sort of comes in.
In terms of the actual audits that you either conduct or that you help with in terms of readiness, how do you approach those audits or help with readiness? If somebody came to you and said, I need to get ready or I need an audit, where would you start and what are the key things you focus on?
Yeah, so I'll start from like the foundation, sort of what are we actually doing in these audits? And it was an evolution for us where we focused a lot early on the subject matter. So we did a lot of consulting kind of engagements or assessments where we're going in and we're really doing impact assessments of systems. We're interviewing stakeholders. We're testing the system, gathering data, getting evidence of how these systems behave. But as soon as regulations started actually getting signed, we realized that That's not exactly how a lot of these audits are going to proceed. It's going to be much more the internal teams will do these things because those are the regulations, and that we will be providing compliance on top of that. We're going to be verifying what they did. And so we made a very deliberate decision to sort of follow assurance standards. And so for most of the work that we do, we follow ISA E3000 or the sort of the US, and they're very much, there's a significant overlap there. And Australia's got their own assurance standards as well. And
we just took the ISA and made it an ASAE. So
yeah, exactly. So, and those standards, I think, were very apropos for what we were doing because there was a lot of flexibility. It was more about, I have a piece of information which I want to increase the veracity of that information. I want to increase somebody else's confidence in that information. And so we basically use that. And so the process for us, when someone comes to us and says, we want an audit done, the very first question is like, what is your environment? What are you worried about? What is important to your stakeholders? What's important to your company? Where do you operate? Right. And so from that, we identify a normative standard. There's got to be something that we're checking against. Right. And it could be something internal. I mean, we prefer it's not that, but it would be better to have something that's well recognized and external, like a law or a standard. And we identify that normative statement. And the question to the company is, okay, have you done these things? And if you've done these things that are in the standard and you want to demonstrate to other people that you've done them, then we can conduct an audit. And that audit really is an assurance engagement, and it could be reasonable or limited assurance. And probably your audience is familiar with these sorts of things. But essentially, we just say, you need to demonstrate to us that you have done these things. Now, there's lots of different ways to do that. One is to say, here's the standard, and we've done everything in that standard. That's much more like an ISO type audit, where these statements are sort of written by some external. So you literally just use that normative standard, or like the EU AI Act. I comply with the EU AI Act, right? That is one case where you would give us documentation to say that you adhere to that, and line by line, we have to go check and make determinations that we have reasonable assurance that you have done all of those things. Now, there obviously is a lot of interpretation involved, and there's a lot of professional judgment and risk associated with that. There are other kinds of engagements where it's much more granular. So someone could say, for instance, and this has happened before, I have an AI system and I have tested it in these ways, and they will produce a document that says, here's how we have tested the system. This is the way it behaves. These are the numbers that we got. These are the definitions. Maybe they reference some other definitions that are external. Maybe they have a separate document that has definitions about what those metrics mean. Then we come in and we do an assurance engagement over those statements. And so that's more complicated. It can be more complicated because we have to control what's being said, and not everything can be verified. We can't provide reasonable assurance against anything. And so there we've had to sort of develop processes internally for like, what do we do? How do we check the auditability of those statements? And we might come back and say, well, we can't provide assurance about these statements. You can put it in the document, but we're going to have to be very specific about what. Maybe we're just verifying the numbers. Maybe we're verifying that you've done a risk assessment or that you have a governance committee, those kind of things. But certain things we can't verify. Anyway, that's probably more detail than you were looking for, but that's roughly kind of the way most of our engagements go.
And what are the key things that you're looking for? So would it be broad governance? Would it be ensuring risk assessments have been done? Would it be ensuring impact assessments have been done? What are the sort of the key building blocks of what that audit process might include?
So it depends a little bit on the normative standard. Now, we have one that we kind of had to construct ourselves for New York City, which is the one that has a hard law that says you have to have done a bias audit of your system, your hiring system. So in that case, we didn't feel like auditing somebody's testing was enough because we knew that risk and governance were important. And so in this case, we kind of identified 3 pillars that we thought like you had to have these 3 pillars to substantively mitigate the risk of that AI system. And it was governance, which is really about like just there are people who are ultimately responsible and accountable for managing the risks of that system. That's an easy one to satisfy sort of superficially. It's a hard one to do sort of substantively, like really have somebody that's responsible. But that's one pillar. It could be a committee, it could be a person, it could be a group of people that have processes associated with that. The other pillar is risk. And for us, like we really focus on risk identification, like risk assessment, not so much the mitigation bit, just because we didn't want to impose too many things that were sort of supererogatory to the law. But we thought that if I could only do one thing with this system to mitigate the risk is to simply know where the risks are. And so that pillar was really focused on, have you thought through the stakeholders, thought through the risks associated with that system, identified them and prioritized them. And so we have kind of criteria around simply doing that. And whether you do something about it or not, that's not part of that standard or that framework. But we do think that just having that visibility within the organization is important. And then the third pillar is the technical testing, because these are technical systems, they have their algorithms, and you need to have metrics associated with that. You need to monitor those systems somehow, the behavior of those systems. And so metrics have to be formed. Bias is a natural one. So New York City, it's bias, which leads, it's disparate impact, but it's really just bias. But it could be other ones. And we've done other engagements where those metrics were different. Maybe it's something to do with the robustness or the reliability of the system or the accuracy. But some sort of metric and some way of connecting those metrics to things that matter, which happen in the risk assessment. And so that sort of triangle, we feel, based on kind of our research and experience so far, is sort of like the most germane to risk. And I would say if a company were to focus on what do I want to do to like mitigate the risk, those three pillars kind of have to be there. And that's what we can focus on those. And that's what we tend to focus on in the audit, is to really look at, have you assessed risk in a way that is coherent and prioritize them in a way that is understandable and you've justified? Have you done some technical testing and are those numbers accurate? We have to check those numbers, of course, and the processes. And then do you have some governance around it?
So you're talking about broad risk assessments and identifying those risk scenarios, et cetera, and being able to determine where that sits. In terms of the nature of algorithms or AI systems that you're involved in auditing, I imagine there'll be lots of traditional models over the years, but what are you seeing in terms of the split between the demand for audit work or consulting work that relates to generative AI, which is probably more stochastic, and versus traditional models, which were a bit more deterministic, broadly speaking?
So in terms of trends, we've seen a huge shift over the past 2 years where companies that we audited several years ago that were using traditional sort of discriminative or regression type models to predict things are switching to generative AI as a base. And then we're getting a much more, almost everything that we deal with now has generative AI components at least to it. And sometimes it's to extract data that then get fed into a discriminative model. Sometimes it's fully end-to-end, like agentic, where everything's run by large language models. And so we're seeing a lot of it. Now, in terms of how that affects the audit process and the way we conduct ourselves, it does change a lot. So things like materiality might be different. We understand that they are stochastic. And so, for instance, when we're checking some numbers, so a company has done a bunch of evaluations, right? So we recommend that they sort of put those evaluations into buckets that correspond to risk so that it's just easier for us to understand and audit what are the evals for. But they'll run evals on their system and they might monitor that but they'll get numbers, and those numbers are things that we assure. And so when we test, we have to do much more direct testing. And so I hesitate to call it red teaming because I don't think that it's not red teaming per se, but we do have to probe the models to make sure that on average, the results of the evaluations are the numbers that they're giving. And it introduces a lot of uncertainty. And in some cases, we have to be very careful about how the audit report is written too, because the testing will be done and the numbers will be given, like 95% pass rate on this particular eval set, right? But given the assurance standard that we're following, we have to think about what is the intended user going to think about that number. And if the way that the statements are made by the company are such that it could mislead them into thinking that 95% of the time when I use it, I won't see this type of behavior. Let's say it's toxic language or something. That's not actually what that number means. What that number means is they have a curated evaluation test set. It has this many rows in it, and 95% of those passed. But that doesn't mean that in the wild, that's the way it's going to behave, because there's a mismatch between those two domains. And so we often have to come back to the clients and say, you need to soften this language. You need to be more explicit about what this actually means, because the intended user could misunderstand. And the differences between what those numbers are between the testing and the real world could be material for the risk. And so it changes the way that reports have to be written. It changes the way we have to substantively test those systems.
So you've got the difference between the evaluation data set that is used, those prompts or whatever else it is that are being used to test. And then you've got the fact that each time you try, it might give you a different answer. Where so deterministic would be, it's always, or pretty much close to always, going to be the same. If you've got the same model and the same data, you're going to get the same result largely. Now we're getting different results. How do you deal with that variability where even if you did have the exact same data set for evaluation and you try to replicate the results that were produced, you might end up with something different?
The general philosophy is we do have to come up with some materiality threshold for ourselves, and so let's say we feel like, 5%, let's just say 5%. We just pick a threshold, right? There has to be some justification for it. And it's probably going to be risk-based. And so we have to justify for ourselves, why are we picking this? But let's say we pick it. There's several ways in which that 5% could show up. So let's say here's this number that gets reported. I might sample a bunch of evals from that whole data set, right? A random sampling of 100. And I run it through and I get more than 10% difference in that. Well, is that really the materiality that I worry about? Is that violating my threshold? Probably not. And so we have to come up with some way, or maybe it does, right? But we have to justify, what does it mean? When is that 5% relevant, or the 10%, whatever we've chosen? And so the way I think we typically approach it is to say, well, let's run this eval set 50 times. And we'll take the average of those 50. Right. After 50 times, if it's more than 10% away from what they reported, or let's say 5 is better. When you're doing these averages, you want smaller. It had better be within 5% of what they reported, or else we think that's a material difference between, but we have to justify that, and it will change. And it depends on whether they've set the temperature. So in some cases, for those who know large language models, you can set what's called the temperature. If I set the temperature down to 0, I can make it deterministic. Mm. Deterministic meaning if I put up the same prompt in twice, I get the same result out.
Or fairly close.
Or fairly close, right? Because there might be some white spaces or some uncertainty in the system. And in some cases, depending on whether you use Azure or your what API you're using, you get some weird results. But even when the temperature turned down, then there's a question of, here's this prompt. What if I were to reword that in a way that is substantively the same? Like it has the same meaning, but it's slightly worded differently. And I put it in. Do I get the same results then? Does it pass or fail according to their threshold? And so that's another sense of the materiality that we have to worry about. Do we just take it at face value, or do we want to look at substantively, if I perturb that, will it get me the same results? All of these are complications that make this kind of work totally fascinating, but also really difficult. And so we have to articulate very clearly when we're doing it, what are we setting for materiality, and how do we manage that uncertainty And then it has to be expressed in our audit report very clearly exactly what we did. And so the way the procedures are described have to be a little more verbose than like if I were just counting the number of cars in a parking lot or some other kind of assurance engagement.
Okay, that makes sense. And I imagine that would then extend to an expectation or maybe, good guidance for the organization that's actually doing the implementation would be when they're doing the evaluation to do it multiple times and have the various different scenarios and settings and parameters. And so, it's not just let's throw some testing at it and see what comes out, but let's do it a few times and see whether there are significant differences and try to average it out so we can sort of, have a better feel going into the audit as to what might come out.
Yeah, I think it does change. And one thing that we're seeing is that there's a gap in the knowledge of the practitioners who are working within the organization. There's also a gap in the auditors as well, which that's part of what our training is, sort of trying to fill that gap. But inside the companies, what we found a lot of times, not to zero any particular, because there are people who have wonderful developers and people who are very, very smart. But that kind of like a scientific approach of I want to categorize the uncertainty of my results, which is a very fundamental to science. My PhD's in astrophysics. We get like sometimes 5 photons from a star, right? But we get like 1,000 photons or 100,000 photons just from the atmosphere. And so we have to interrogate everything to really figure out whether information is actually what we think it is. And so it's in our nature and in most scientists' nature to interrogate information. Now, data science has not in general had that kind of culture, especially because of the rush to get talent. A lot of people are going through boot camps and just like going from a different field, cybersecurity or IT, into data science, and they haven't really cultivated that kind of thinking. And so that's a real problem for us because they don't know. They think if I run a test, an evaluation set, I'm going to get a number, and that's good. And they might notice that there are differences, but they don't necessarily know how do they approach identifying. The central limit theorem is not necessarily in their core DNA. And so that's been a struggle. And I think that's something that we have really wanted to like figure out how do we tackle that in terms of getting education out there about testing these systems in a way that's going to be robust and you can demonstrate it to an auditor that you've characterized the uncertainty well enough.
Okay, so you've trained the auditors, you've trained the general employee base, and so now turning attention to developers and data scientists and those, so that I guess not to make your life easier, but to reduce the risk overall, really.
Yeah, I think it's necessary. The overall level of literacy needs to increase, I think, like across the board. And, even within, like, we know that we have to keep up, right? Because things are changing so fast. So we've audited systems and companies that have systems that have some agentic features, right? But more and more, there are just like really highly autonomous agents that need to get audited, need to get certified in some way. And that's a research question for us. Like could we apply the same framework we would for like general LLMs to a system that now has access to tools that can execute things autonomously? And I think the answer is we can't. We can use some of those lessons, but even those lessons are kind of like still cutting edge or in development. And now we have these agents. And so it's like there has to be upskilling continuously. There has to be like a continuous push to like raise the literacy level for all of the practitioners in risk, compliance, auditing, all of these fields.
So talking about the fast pace, and a lot of what we're seeing nowadays is really coming out at a faster pace than we can forget consume, but even, understand and think about and be across. What are you seeing in terms of deployment of AI systems? Is it more in-house build, or is it more buying, or is there a bit of a combination of that going on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the majority of what's happening right now, I feel like, is in-house configurations of third-party generative AI kind of environments. So what I mean by that is like I've chosen Copilot as my platform of choice, which of course, references OpenAI models. And within that platform, I have tools to develop agents or develop chatbots or to develop different kind of applications for my own internal use on my own internal data. And so there's a lot of that happening. Or you're a Google company and you've got Gemini and you're trying to organize and develop internal processes using that platform, or Dataiku or Databricks or whatever. There's just many of these kind of platforms. We're seeing a lot of that. Then, of course, that's at the deployer level. So the deployers are now becoming providers, like to use the EU AI Act kind of terminology. A lot of what we traditionally think of deployers is they're developing these tools now based on some models. But we also have a huge proliferation of these new vendors that have these sort of vertical AI. So for AI for HR or AI for education, AI for, financial services and like risk assessment or anti-money laundering or whatever it is. And so we're seeing a lot of those. And there's a huge explosion of these companies that are like getting into that. And they're getting some success selling into enterprise, or at least selling into some bigger companies. And so that's a not an insignificant part of the market as well.
Right. What does that mean for the way that organizations that are deploying evaluate or assess risk? Because risk will be quite different if developing a traditional model in-house and deploying it versus buying a whole bunch of different systems or components and putting them together and then relying on third parties to have done some of the other testing that needs to be done and bias evaluations and things. So, like, how does that change? Or have you seen quite a significant change in the thinking around assessing those risks?
Yeah. So the third-party risk has been around for a while, and in the sense that because of the cybersecurity or information security and sort of privacy areas, people have had conscious of the fact that I'm exposed when I bring on a third-party vendor to process my data in some way. I think the shift has been, the struggle rather, has been what are the new processes in that procurement that we need to put to get some mitigation of these new AI risks. And people, you can find checklists here and there, and some of those are implemented okay. Others are just really poorly implemented, in the sense that you give them a vendor questionnaire and the answers that come back are very unsatisfactory, and then you don't know what to do, right? Because there's no, what is the recourse for that? And so I think what we've seen is that they fall back on sort of the core information security principles. So the focus is primarily on, are these new APIs that you're integrating going to expose my data externally? So all of the regular encryption stuff. Are you going to use my data to train your system? Those are questions people can wrap their brain around. But some of the other risks around bias or like validity, frankly, like, is this tool a valid tool for the thing you say it's doing? There's some missing pieces there that I think need to get filled in. And you need an expert, that's like, those are things that people like us, we can ask the right questions and we can understand what the answers are in a way that would filter through sort of like I just opened up a spreadsheet, or I have a Google Doc that has the policy in place, but I haven't done anything substantive, versus I've done some substantive risk mitigation for you. Now, for the other area where there's a lot of uncertainty is the in-house development, because a lot of deployers don't have the experience of what do I do when I'm developing this thing internally. Now, they have an IT function typically, right, that is going to handle information security things. But now all of a sudden you've procured something like Copilot, or you have a subscription to a private GPT or something. And now I have people who are not data scientists developing some applications to do stuff in my company. What do I ask of them to make sure I'm mitigating those risks? That's a new uncharted territory for a lot of these companies. And that's where they also need a little bit of help to identify, like, what are the core things? And in fact, those 3 pillars that I mentioned are a great place to start. Like, is there somebody who's just looking out for the risk there? Have we categorized what risks there could be? Just get a meeting together and do it and have like a little risk register for it. And then have we done any monitoring at all or testing, even minimally? Just pick a metric and go with it. But that's still, it's early stages for most companies there.
So in terms of that, and particularly within regulated industries like financial services, what sort of skills would leaders within financial services expect of their teams? And what is it that they need to develop in terms of skills within those teams to stay ahead of AI governance expectations? And I guess maybe just catch up and then stay ahead.
Yeah, that's a tough thing. I mean, we're still constantly trying to figure that out. At the core of it is like an understanding of how the AI systems work. Now, because it's so easy now to develop things with large language models, it's not hard to like get away with not understanding how they work because it just does everything for you. And I think getting some training on how do these systems actually work? What does it mean? Like where does the large language model get access to your information, right? You're querying documents. What does that process actually look like? Having some basic understanding of it, because that's going to inform the next thing, which is how do I assess the risks of that process? So there's a risk assessment piece, which BABL as a company, we spent so much time doing those and trying to develop methodologies for those risk assessments that we feel like there is a practice, right? It's a professional practice of assessing the risk of algorithmic systems. It's not just the standard enterprise risk management that people do. It's not standard risk assessments you would do under information security. They're related, but they're substantively different. And so understanding what that process looks like is important, like how you would identify stakeholders and really think through and identify the unique risks that come from those systems. So it doesn't have to be super deep, and we teach it, and we have a class that teaches it. And I think we've seen that people can get those skills to a pretty high degree in the course of a few weeks and some dedicated practice. And then the technical bit. And so some of the technical metrics, just understanding what metrics are out there, right? And some basic understanding of how you would interpret those. And so this goes for product owners. This goes for like the subject matter. Somebody in that group needs to understand that we can measure things like how relevant the retrieved information is, for instance, for LLMs, or how complete that information is. There's methodologies for extracting that. And I understand what those numbers mean. Or there's some out of the box evaluations we might be able to use. I think that's the core. And if you have those, most people can bring other skills. If I'm a risk professional, I understand what it means to sort of try to categorize that risk and maybe attach it to a dollar value or something like that in my company, or put it in my risk register. But I need to understand how to think through that first. And then I might understand machine learning, but I don't necessarily understand how I'm going to extract a risk relevant metric from my system that I can monitor over time, and it will inform decisions about how I govern that system. And that's the little ecosystem that is a tough nut to crack, but I think it's one of the most germane and important ones to crack.
And it starts with understanding the landscape, understanding what the different components are and how they fit together.
Yes, I think the understanding of the AI, what AI can and can't do. I see a lot of misconceptions about what AI is, what generative AI is and what it's doing. And from simple things of like assuming that it just remembers everything. It doesn't necessarily remember everything that you've talked to it, right? There's a context windows in these. And so unless the system's been set up in such a way that it can retrieve information that it's gotten from you in the past, then it doesn't necessarily remember what you asked it 5 months ago.
The one I use doesn't remember what I asked it 5 minutes ago.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And that's a big part of like understanding exactly how it's weighing the things that come into it. Like you don't need comprehensive knowledge of what a transformer is, which is kind of the basis of a lot of these. But you do have to have some understanding of like, how is it weighing the information that's coming in and the recency bias and that kind of thing. If I start going off track and then I try to get back to what I was doing, it's probably going to get confused and it might start doing things I don't like. But I think it's an exciting time though. And I think it's an exciting time for people who are in companies or in this field who have to interact with AI a lot and want to like build a little bit of job security, because governing these systems is something that, eventually will, more pieces of the governance will get replaced by automation as well, by AI. But at least in the near term, one of the kind of few human jobs that is like going to be impenetrable is like ultimately having that oversight and accountability to connect what these systems are doing with the real world. And if you're good at that, and it's hard to find people that are good at that, who are really good at that. And if you can get good at that, that's something that people will recognize and it will be valuable for your career.
Excellent. Shea, we coming up to the end of our time together. I do appreciate the time that we've spent. Just final question. Where can listeners find out more about what BABL does and, potentially connect with you?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So Shea Brown on LinkedIn. And we have a YouTube channel, BABL AI on YouTube. It's where we post a lot of podcasts and interviews. And BABLAI.com is the company page where we have our services and things like that. And if you go to courses.babel.ai, that's where we have some of the training programs, some of which are free, that talk about some of the things that we talked about today.
Fantastic. And we'll put links to all of those in the show notes. Shea, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.